But we've been thinking today about the brokenness of our world. And you don't have to think about this for long, do you, to realize how broken and damaged our world is, whether it's war and conflict, whether it's natural disasters, whether it's climate change, whether it's disease. We see a world all around us that is so incredibly broken. And it leads us to ask the question, what, if anything, can we do about it? What can we do about our broken worlds? And it's interesting, I would suggest, that there are vastly different answers to that question that are offered. Some people, I would suggest, are really optimistic about humanity's ability to solve the major problems of life, to solve the brokenness of our worlds. Yuval Noah Harari is an interesting author. You may have come across his work or heard him speak. He wrote a book called Sapiens, which looked at his kind of interpretation of the history of humanity. And then he wrote this book, Homo Deus, which is his prediction about the future of humanity and beyond. But I won't give you too many spoilers, other than to say that he is broadly very optimistic about humanity's ability to deal with life's great problems. So in the introduction, he talks about how humanity has faced three great enemies: war, famine, and plague. But he says now, thanks to the advancements of modern science, these three things are no longer going to be a problem to us. Now, I did have to find this slightly ironic because I was reading his book in the middle of lockdown as the whole world was brought to a standstill because of a plague called COVID-19. So I thought, well, maybe we've not quite got there. And then in the conclusion, he actually says that very soon we will eradicate the causes of death. And he says we don't need religion anymore to give us eternal life. Science will very soon eradicate old age and death. To which there are lots of things we might want to say. My initial reaction was, well, if we could start with eradicating the common cold, I'll be more confident in the ability to eradicate death, but we'll see where that goes. But here's an example of someone who's very optimistic about our ability to deal with life's problems. But other people are perhaps more pessimistic about humanity's involvement in the world. In fact, some people would give the impression that actually the world would be better off without humanity. I don't know whether you've come across the writings of Raina Wynn. I love her books. She's a fascinating writer. She and her husband were unfortunately evicted from where they lived and spent their year or so being homeless, walking the southwest coastal path in the southwest of England. And her first book shot to prominence, made her a famous author. And she's a beautiful nature writer, observing with such appreciation the beauty of nature. This is her second book, which I was just reading recently on holiday, in which she was then on another walk with her husband in Iceland. But there was a quote in it that really struck me, because for all her appreciation of the beauty of nature, she says this: "Despite our destruction of its equilibrium, the earth and its atmosphere would continue to move as one without us. The earth was rising towards the moments when it would shake like a wet, muddy dog and then go about its business, rid for good of the annoyance of humanity." And that's her view. The world would be better off without us. One day, humanity will be a thing of history and the world would be a better place. But of course, there's questions we might want to ask about that. For instance, if we hold human beings morally responsible for the way we have damaged our worlds, what does that imply about human beings? You see, if we are just another part of nature, why hold nature responsible for the destruction of nature? The very fact that we hold humans responsible seems to imply that there's something different about us as humans. And of course, if the world would be better off without us, then actually the best way to save the world is to eradicate yourself and everyone else. And of course, if the world is better off without us, that leads to a high level of anxiety about our role in it. So I guess I want to ask this question tonight. What if we can't save the world, but what if we could find someone who could? And what if actually discovering that doesn't lead to passivity in the face of a world full of brokenness and problems, but actually could, as we've heard a little bit about already tonight, give us the greatest motivation to want to make a difference? What I want to do tonight is just look at an account from this book that's on your tables. If you want to pick them up and pass them round, that would be really helpful. It's on page 10, the bit that we're going to be looking at. If you weren't here last night, let me just explain. This is one of the biographical accounts of the life of Jesus. It's the earliest, most probably, to be written, and it's the shortest. It's a great place to start. It's free if you'd like to take it away and read that for yourself if you've not yet got a copy. And as we said last night, there are some really good reasons to take this seriously as a historical source to give us a window into the historical Jesus. And Mark, who writes this biographical account, begins it by introducing Jesus in chapter 1. And actually, if you look over on page 2, at the top of page 2, Jesus announces the beginning of his ministry by saying, little verse 15 at the top there, the time has come, the kingdom of God has come near. So Jesus says, I've come to bring an inbreaking of God's kingdom, to sort out the mess of this world. And then over on page 10, we're going to see 3 stories that illustrate for us what that looks like. What does it look like when Jesus' kingdom breaks in and sorts out the mess and the brokenness of our worlds? I'm not going to read them in their entirety because it might take too long, but you can kind of follow along and I'll refer to various bits as we go down. But the first story is there at the end of chapter 4 on page 10 from verse 35. And it refers to Jesus going on a journey with his disciples. They're getting into a boat. His disciples were fishermen. They did this all the time. They were going across a sea, well, actually a large lake really in northern Israel called Galilee. And in verse 37, it says, a furious squall came up. The waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. The disciples are terrified. They think they're going to die. It's worth remembering that the disciples, many of them were fishermen, so they were kind of used to being in stormy weather. So this must have been a major storm that they were in. And they are absolutely terrified. Now, it's hard, isn't it, living in Britain sometimes to appreciate the sheer power of nature, because for most of us, the sheer power of nature is drizzle, isn't it? We live in a fairly benign part of the world where getting damp or a little bit wet is often the worst thing that will happen to us. But there are times, and maybe you've experienced it, where you have seen the sheer power of nature, a raging storm, or a tsunami, or an earthquake, or a volcano, or a forest fire. The power of nature, as it were, out of control. And it is awesome. And the disciples don't know what to do, so they wake Jesus up, because remarkably, Jesus is asleep in the back of the boat. And they say to him, verse 38, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" And verse 39, he, Jesus, got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Literally, shut up. It's kind of what you would say to an annoying class of teenagers who are being rowdy. Shut it! And amazingly, it says the wind died down and it was completely calm. If you live near the sea, you'll know that it normally takes a long time after the wind has died down for it to be completely calm. But it happened instantaneously. And unsurprisingly, they're now petrified, but not of the storm, but of Jesus. And they're terrified, verse 31, and they asked, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." And I bet you would be too. I mean, if this actually happened, that's pretty powerful, isn't it? I mean, I can't even still my own bathwater. Have you ever sloshed up and down in the bath? No, maybe not for a long time. Try to stop your bathwater. It's very difficult, isn't it? Imagine being a disciple of Jesus in a boat and seeing this happen. You would have been terrified. So that's the first encounter. Second happens immediately after they get to the other side, and this is in chapter 5. When they get to the other side, it's a case of kind of out of the frying pan into the fire, because they get out of the boat, verse 2, and a man with an impure spirit came from the tombs to meet him. This man lived in the tombs, and no one can bind him anymore, not even with a chain, for he had often been chained hand and foot. He tore the chains apart and broke the irons off his feet. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and in the hills, he would cry out and cut himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and fell on his knees in front of him, and he shouted at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High? In God's name, don't torture me." Now, this, particularly maybe to many of us, just seems pretty weird, doesn't it? What is going on here? And you may have all sorts of questions about it, and you can stick them in the Slido if you want. But putting it briefly, I think what's happening here is we're seeing an extreme example of what evil can do, its destructive influence in the life of a person. The story looked before might be a case of natural evil, the chaos of nature. Here we get the chaos of human nature, a man whose life has been destroyed by the power of evil. And you see what it's done? It's cut him off from his friends and his family. I mean, he's living in the tombs. That's not normally where you choose to live, is it? It's cut him off from God. Jesus, this representative of God, is someone that he hates and wants to get away from him. And also it's caused him to be self-destructive. He's cutting himself with stones. And that's what evil does. It destroys our relationships with each other, with God, and it makes us self-destructive as well. And yet again, Jesus has power, doesn't he, in this situation, to set this man free. At the end of the story, it's kind of like completely the opposite from the beginning. Now he's not naked and out of his mind. He's dressed, verse 15, sitting in his right mind. He's sent back to his community, back to his family and his friends. And rather than wanting Jesus to go away, he wants to follow Jesus. A complete 180-degree transformation in the life of this man. And then the next story is in verse 21, just down at the bottom of page 11. And actually it's two stories in one, because it starts with this guy called Jairus. He's a synagogue ruler, and he comes to Jesus in desperation. Look down at verse 23. He pleaded earnestly with Jesus, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so she can be healed and live." Jairus is in desperation. His 12-year-old daughter is dying. And he's heard that there's this guy who's able to heal, and he thinks, if only I can get Jesus to my daughter, there might just be a chance. And so they start out on the journey, but they're interrupted by this woman, verse 25, who has been subject to bleeding for 12 years. Isn't that interesting? She's been ill for as long as this girl has been alive. She's suffered a great deal, verse 26, and nothing has made her better. She comes up and touches Jesus' clothes because she thinks, if I just touch Jesus, I'll be made well. And she is. And what follows is a conversation between Jesus and the woman. But all of this delays Jesus, by which point, well, just look down at what happens in verse 35. While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" I mean, 10 out of 10 for tact and pastoral sensitivity, right? I mean, how to break the news, not. Pretty blunt. And you can imagine, I bet actually Jairus knew what they were going to say before they said it. The look on their face would have given it away, wouldn't it? And suddenly the bottom falls out of his life. Verse 36, overhearing what they said, Jesus told them, "Don't be afraid, just believe." You've got to be pretty sure of yourself, haven't you? To say to someone that when they've just lost their daughter. They eventually get to the house, there's wailing and there's commotion. And Jesus says, verse 39, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." And they laughed at him. If you're wondering, by the way, why people can go from wailing and crying to laughing so quickly, in that culture you would have employed people to come and wail, to grieve kind of outside the house. So maybe these people were the kind of professional grievers outside. But they're laughing because they know she's dead. After he put them out, verse 40, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him, and he went into where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." And immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. Jesus says to this little girl, "Get up," a bit like we would say to someone who is asleep, "Get up." And for Jesus, raising the dead, it would appear, is as easy as it is for us to wake the sleeping. Although actually I've seen how some students sleep, and I want to suggest it's easier for Jesus to raise the dead than it is to wake some students from sleeping. But the point is amazing, isn't it? Look, here is Jesus. He doesn't just have power over a sick woman, over a dead girl. Now, why have we just looked at those three stories? Because I think Mark, who's writing this book, is keen to show us that Jesus is the one that has power over life's greatest problems. You see, what are the three things that we've seen there? Natural evil, the power and chaos of nature out of control. Human evil, the destructive power of evil in individual lives, destroying us from within. Sickness, death, and suffering, and all of the pain and the grief that brings. That's pretty much the world's problems, isn't it? Summed up into three stories. Natural evil, human evil, suffering, pain, and death. And did you notice in all of those stories how powerless people were to do anything about it? You know, the disciples, they're fishermen, but they can't sort out the storm or save themselves. The people in the town where this man had been living were powerless to control him and change him. Jairus might be an influential leader in his community, but he's powerless to be able to sort out his daughter. And the doctors, in verse 26, they were powerless to deal with the woman's sickness. It's interesting, actually, little aside, Luke, who was a medical doctor, wrote one of the other gospel accounts about Jesus. And he also recounts this story, but he leaves out the bit about her suffering at the hands of many doctors, because maybe he was a little bit more keen to protect the reputation of his profession. But the point is this, that no one could do anything about these things, right? Ultimately, what do we do in the face of a chaotic nature, human evil, and death? We're limited, aren't we? And yet, what does Jesus do? Well, he can do what we can't. And what does it take? It takes a word, a touch. What's impossible for us seems quite possible for Jesus. So why does Mark put all these stories together? Because I think what he's wanting us to do is see a snapshot of what Jesus' kingdom would look like. What does God's kingdom look like? It looks like a world where the chaos of nature is brought back under control, where human evil is eradicated, where death and disease are a thing of history. And in a sense, what we've got is like, I don't know if you like the film Back to the Future, but a picture of the future in the past. And I think this is really important because so often when we think about, if there is life after death, if you think about that kind of thing, we might feel like, well, it's just a kind of spiritual thing, this kind of spiritual dimension that happens when we die. But actually, according to the Bible, the future is not just a spiritual dimension. The Bible doesn't so much talk about heaven and hell, but heaven and earth. And the future that the Bible talks about is not of going to heaven, but of a new creation. In fact, the word new there means to renew, to restore, to transform. And so what we've got here are little snapshots and pictures of what the ultimate Christian vision of the future is all about. And it's not about playing harps on a cloud, wearing a nightie, going to choir practice. It's about the restoration of a physical world, the destruction of evil and suffering, the transformation of all of creation. That's the picture of the future that Jesus is painting in these stories. That's the vision of the future that the Bible gives. Now, you may have lots of questions about how we could know whether that is true at this point. You may want to stick them in the Slido. You may also want to come on Friday because we're going to look at one of the strongest reasons why we can have this confidence in the future. And it's not just these stories, but it's the ultimate story of Jesus' resurrection and the evidence for that. So do come back at the end of the week. But what does it mean as we try and pull this together? Well, I think firstly it means that if this is true, we can have hope in the face of a broken world. We can have hope. I don't know whether you like the Lord of the Rings books or films. I love them. And my favourite character in the books and the films, of course, is Sam. Anyone else a big fan of Sam? Yeah. He's great, isn't he? He's loyal, he's committed. Sam's fantastic. And there's this moment in the second film, The Two Towers, just towards the end, where it feels like there is no hope. Okay, the mountains of Mordor are looming large. The fellowship has been broken. And it just feels like there's no hope for them, for the world. It feels like everything is bleak. And then there's this amazing moment where Frodo is wanting to give up, and Sam turns to him and he says this. He says, "It's like in the old stories, Mr. Frodo. Full of darkness and danger they were. And sometimes he didn't want to know the end. How could the end be happy? How could the world go back to the way it was after so much bad had happened? But in the end, it's only a passing thing, this shadow. Even darkness will pass and a new day will come. And when it does, the sun will shine out all the brighter. Those are the stories that stay with you, Mr. Frodo, even though you're too young to understand why." It's a beautiful quote, isn't it? You can tell because I memorized it. But it's beautiful because he doesn't just say, like, the sun will shine again in February in the UK. That is a great hope to hold on to, by the way. The sun will shine again, but he says it will shine out all the brighter. Now, I think actually Tolkien there was reflecting something of his Christian worldview. Because there's another part of the Bible where it says that our present sufferings are achieving a glory that will outweigh them all. In other words, there is a hope that the sun will shine out all the brighter. That the current state of our world is not the way it always has been, and it's not the way it always will be. We can be hopeful about the future. We're not just heading towards annihilation and extinction. We're heading towards hope, if this is true. But can I also say this? It doesn't just give us hope, but can I suggest that that hope also inspires action? Because you might be thinking, well, yeah, if this is true, and if we have this hope that one day Jesus is going to sort out all of the major problems of life, does that mean I just sit back and do nothing? And that's a really important question to consider. And it's an important question to consider of any worldview in the face of the problems we face in life. For instance, in a naturalistic worldview where this is all there is, then ultimately, of course, we may extend humanity's involvement on planet Earth for a while, but everything is heading towards extinction. And so you could argue, well, what's the point of everything if at the end of the day it's going to count for nothing? Some worldviews talk about life beyond death, but it's in a different dimension. It's in heaven or paradise. And again, you could argue, what's the point of that if this world is not really what it's all about? It's just a place of testing on the way to somewhere else. But the Christian worldview says actually God created this world and it is good, and he is going to restore this world and make it new. And so therefore what we do in this world really does matter. And it really does make a difference. And our knowledge that one day he will sort it out fully and finally doesn't lead us to be passive in the face of the world's problems, but should actually motivate us to want to make a difference in the way that we can now. Now, I've been trying to rack my brains all day about how I could try and illustrate this. And I was thinking maybe the best way to illustrate it is like this. Imagine if one day in the future, probably about 50 years' time, once you've paid off your student debt, you try and save up a deposit for a house. And you finally manage to put down the deposit on a rather dilapidated shack because it's all you can afford. And you go in and it's not in good ways. The roof is leaking, the windows are falling out, the door is off its hinges. But you know a good guy who's a very good builder, and he's willing to come and sort things out. You're not a builder. You can try your hand at DIY. You could probably paint a wall or two, but you need someone else to come in and sort out the major stuff. They need to sort out the roof, the structure, the doors, the windows. But if you knew that they were coming to do some of the major stuff, then that would probably inspire you to think, okay, well, what can I do? Maybe I can paint a wall. Maybe I can fix a tap. I can do what I can do in the knowledge that there's someone coming to do what I can't do. You're working together with an end in mind. Of course, if you knew that the place had actually been condemned and in a few weeks' time they were going to come and rip the whole thing down, you probably wouldn't bother painting anything, would you? What's the point of trying to fix the tap if at the end of the day it's all been condemned anyway? If our world is ultimately just going to be condemned, what is the point? But actually, if we know there is someone coming who can sort out the stuff that we can't sort out, that inspires us to do what we can do. And as we've heard tonight, we can do something. We may not all be doing a PhD in Arctic flow, but we can do something to make a difference in our worlds. Knowing that God will one day sort out the mess of our world leads us to want to make a difference now. It might be in the area of the environment. It might be in alleviating suffering. It might be in mitigating the effects of evil. It can be in all sorts of ways. But can I suggest that hope is a much better motivator to make a difference in our world than despair? And if we have this hope, it can motivate us. Last question to ask, and then we'll go to some time for discussion, is this. You might be saying, well, okay, if this is true, if this is the hope that we can have, why doesn't God just do it now? He's obviously got the power, hasn't he? I mean, we've just seen already that 2,000 years ago, Jesus had the power to sort out life's greatest problems. So why doesn't he click his fingers and sort out the mess of our worlds? And I think the answer is not that God doesn't care, but actually conversely that he does. But the problems of our world are not just out there, are they? If we're really honest, the problems of the world are also in here. In here. Because if we wanted a world that was without all suffering, injustice, and evil, would we be part of it? Oh, it's easy to point the finger at what others do, but do we always do what we should? And actually what the Bible says is that before God makes a new world, he wants to make new people. He wants to bring transformation to us as individuals so that one day and through us, he can bring transformation to the world. And that transformation is on offer through Jesus. Jesus can bring that transformation. And how does he do it? Well, if you keep reading through this Mark story, at the end, you'll read ultimately how Jesus is nailed to a cross. And it's interesting what happens. If you read the account, and I encourage you to do so, you'll see that various things happen. There's darkness, there's an earthquake, there's a crown of thorns placed upon his head. Symbols of the chaos of a cursed creation, according to the Bible, are all happening as Jesus dies. There's mocking, there's injustice, there's hatred. Pictures of human evil at their very worst being expressed at human goodness at its very best. And then what do we have? Well, human suffering and death, and probably the most painful form ever invented, Roman crucifixion. What is happening? What is happening is that Jesus is absorbing all of the worst of our world, all of the brokenness of our world, all the chaos of our world, so that somehow through that, we can have the hope that all of these things can be dealt with. Through Jesus' death, we can have life. And through what he did, we can know this transformation. Each one of us. Now, I don't know what you think about this. There's a lot of stuff in this tonight, and maybe you've got lots of questions. Maybe you're quite skeptical about what you've heard this evening. And if that is the case, then firstly, I just want to say thanks so much for coming. Thanks for being willing to engage in this, even if you've got big questions about whether any of this is true. We really appreciate you being willing to give us a hearing, even if it was more for the pizza than for the talk that you came. But thank you for coming. But can I just throw out a little challenge, if that is you tonight? If you're in that kind of place of being more skeptical, I guess my question is, as we face the reality of a broken world, what worldview will you adopt that will not only make sense of the brokenness that we see, but also potentially give you hope in the face of it. Because all of us have to face up to the reality of our world somehow. And it's worth thinking that through. Maybe you're here tonight and you're saying, well, actually, I've got a lot of questions. I really need to think about this more. There's some big stuff here that I've not thought about before. And again, if that is you, we're really glad that you're here. And we would love to give you the opportunity to check this out further. There's a whole week of events as well as tonight. And there's also something after this week called The Search, which we'll tell you about at the end, where you can continue to ask your questions and to check this out further. But it may be tonight that you're saying, actually, I think this could be true. And actually, if Jesus is offering transformation, not just for the world out there, but real transformation for me, I want in on that. And the great news is, you can. He wants to offer that to you. He won't force it upon you, but he'll offer it to anyone who's willing to receive it. And maybe actually what would be helpful to do would be to talk to God and to say to him something like this: God, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that sometimes I've been part of the problem of this world. But God, thank you that in Jesus you were willing to absorb the brokenness and the pain that we deserve. God, please come into my life and transform me. And then help me to become an agent of transformation in the world. And those words, sorry, thank you, please, they could be a way of just talking to God and getting started in that relationship with him.